Lots more people streaming in. Wonderful. Hi, good evening. My name's Isabella. Welcome to our webinar. So I'd like to begin this evening with an acknowledgement that across the continent we're calling in from the sovereign land of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and that this land was stolen from them. I pay my respects to those who cared for the land that I'm calling in from, Wurundjeri country, for many thousands of years, and to all First Nations elders, and extend that acknowledgement to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people on the call tonight. It's currently NIDOC Week, an opportunity to celebrate the oldest living culture in the world, and I encourage you to check out events near you via the link in the chat. NIDOC Week was born out of a protest known as the Day of Mourning, and I'd like to recognise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were the first campaigners for equality and human rights in this country. We're in their debt. Welcome to our first Democracy Deep Dive webinar, Interrogating Integrity. The plan for tonight is that I will provide some quick context on the reforms we're discussing, and then most of the hour will be spent hearing from our wonderful panel, who I'll introduce shortly. We've set this event up for an hour, and I promise I'll end us officially on time. But if people are interested in hanging out for 10 minutes or so to connect with each other, like we would if we were meeting in person, it's the kind of equivalent of drinks in the foyer afterwards, we will have an opportunity at 7:30 to jump into some breakout rooms. If you haven't already, please open up the chat function and introduce yourself, share where you're calling in from tonight, and why you've joined us. So, hi to people who've just joined. My name's Isabella. I'm the digital campaigner at the Australian Democracy Network, and tonight's event is hosted by the Our Democracy campaign. We bring together people, organisations and experts from across the country to work towards a shared vision, a political system where our elected representatives reflect the values and concerns of our communities, and where decision-making is balanced and fair, with people and the planet at its heart. Our mission is to end the corrosive impact of corporate overreach on our democracy. Right now, Australian politicians and action on crucial issues like climate change and healthcare are hamstrung because our state is captured. Corporate capture is what happens when powerful industry groups and corporations are able to influence the political system to benefit them and their profits at the expense of everyday Australians and the issues that we care most about. To fix this, the Our Democracy campaign has developed the Framework for a Fair Democracy. This is a set of reforms to clean up our system so that it works for everyone, not just those with the deepest pockets. If you haven't seen it before, the framework has 3 pillars, and there's just going to be a link to it coming up in the chat now. Those pillars are on the slides here. They're stamp out corruption, end cash for access, and level the playing field in election debates. That first pillar, stamping out corruption, has 4 demands, and it's the focus of our discussion tonight. These first 2 asks, a strong Federal Integrity Commission and an enforceable code of conduct for politicians, have been huge stories over the previous term of government and are extremely popular with voters across the political spectrum. They're also really winnable in the near term, which is exciting, but the devil is in the detail. And to get into that detail, I'm really pleased to be joined by experts on these issues tonight to dive in with you. I'll be facilitating the discussion based on the excellent questions that were provided by you during the RSVP process. Thank you so much for your thoughts. I've used them to shape the discussion tonight, and I'm hoping that we'll have a chance to come into any follow-up questions in the chat later on. There were far too many great questions in the registration process to get to. I've tried to compile them in a way that I think will bring most of the information together, and having had a quick chat with our panel at 6, I can say we're definitely in for a juicy discussion. In just a moment, we're actually going to turn off the Zoom chat function just for 15 minutes or so that everyone can focus on the presentations and our speakers, and we'll bring it back on for follow-up questions a little bit later in the evening. So Our panel tonight, I'm really pleased to be welcoming Alyssa Shaw, who's the campaign manager at Fair Agenda, a community of 43,000 Australians campaigning for a fair and gender equal future so that we can all live with safety, security and agency. Anthony Whealy QC, who is the former judge of the New South Wales Supreme Court of Appeal and currently the chair of the Centre for Public Integrity. CPI are an independent think tank dedicated to preventing corruption, protecting the integrity of our accountability institutions, reining in executive power, and eliminating undue influence of money in politics in Australia. We love to work with them at the Our Democracy campaign. And we've also got joining us Professor AJ Brown, who's the leader of the Centre for Governance and Public Policy's Public Integrity and Anti-Corruption Research Program. It's quite a mouthful, AJ, and a Professor of Public Policy and Law at the School of Government and International Relations at Griffith University. AJ is a 25-year veteran of developments in Australia's integrity systems and is the board member of Our Democracy partner organisation, Transparency International Australia. And Tony's just going to pop some links in the chat to all of the organisations that our wonderful speakers are from, if you want to investigate them further after this evening's discussion. So to kick things off, I'd like to invite each of the speakers to say hello and to just share why you're personally drawn to work on democracy reform. And we'll go in that order. So Alyssa, and then Anthony, and then AJ. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Isabella, and hello everyone. I'm calling in from Boonwurrung country and wanted to pay my respects and say happy NAIDOC week. It's one of the favourite times in the calendar for me. I actually worked with the NAIDOC committee for some time and they do fabulous work, so it's great to be in a space where we're talking about Indigenous excellence. And of course, speaking of that, we had such a great record number of Indigenous candidates get elected to our parliament, and I suppose that's a nice introduction of and reason for why I think this conversation is so important. And the thing I'll be focusing on tonight is really talking about a code of conduct. But I think that's really in, at a very basic level, restoring public trust in the institution that is our government, dealing with issues, processes, making sure we have fair procedures, but also setting a high expectation for making sure that our parliament is a place that's respectful, that's inclusive, has a culture that we can be proud of, that supports robust debate. And I think this is really all in service, creating a safer culture is really in service of attracting a wide variety of people to make sure that our democracy is representative. And to me, that's really about having skin in the game. We want people in parliament that represent our interests, that represent a diversity of interests. And I would argue that if we had more women and more mothers, for instance, obviously I approach this as a gender equality campaign from that perspective, we probably would have seen a lot of better reforms a lot sooner on childcare, paid parental leave, things like that, rather than what the Albanese government took to the election, which was great reforms on childcare, but hopefully would have had those wins sooner, and particularly a lot of investment in violence prevention. So yes, a better outcome, like better democracy, really impacts us all, and particularly impacts women in this country.
Well, from my point of view, first of all, Alyssa, you must be very pleased to see the Teal independents who were elected to Parliament. I mean, that's really encouraging for all the reasons you've just said. Now, my own introduction to integrity followed a very boring career as a barrister and an even more narrow career as a judge, where you don't have time or inclination to function on things as important as integrity. You're too busy trying to work out whether A should win the contest or B should win the contest. So when I left that judicial life, I was fortunate enough to meet AJ and Transparency International Australia, and I had the privilege of being the chair of that organisation for 3 years. And it was in that context, for the first time, that I came across issues of integrity and tried to understand them. And that was 2015. And ever since then, I've been thoroughly absorbed by the issues of integrity in public administration. Of course, one of the major ones was trying to persuade governments to agree to form a National Integrity Commission. But I've learned a lot broader issues than that too, surrounding integrity, truth in advertising, in political campaigns, the laws surrounding donations and campaign spending, the need to protect our institutions from degradation by government. And it's been really a thrilling journey for me, and I'm still learning. You wouldn't think an old judge could learn much, but I'm learning a lot. And, you know, acting with people like all those who are listening and watching this tonight is very exciting for me. And I hope I can give some valuable input based on my 7 or 8 years of involvement in the area.
I think you've cut the story a little bit short there, Tony, because you did actually run a few anti-corruption inquiries and investigations as well along the way, which paid off big time, especially for the people of New South Wales. I mean, I think I'm involved in democracy reform probably because I was born into it as the son of a political journalist on one hand and a community-based environmental and sustainability activist on the other hand. So I think, but I guess the thing that that sort of drives me in particular, I guess, in the exposure that I've had through both research and working in government and around government on accountability and democracy reform is two things in particular. One is the role of people in speaking up about corruption and what's going on, especially the role of whistleblowers from inside, but people in general, the importance of people's consciousness and their preparedness to speak up about what's going wrong and participate in the political process, but also just do that act of actually calling out what's wrong, without which none of our institutions would survive. But also on the board of Transparency International, I think that we're constantly reminded about how lucky we are in Australia, about how complex and difficult the problems of corruption and accountability are all around the world, that we've been backsliding much more than we realise in terms of our ability to uphold the standards that we sort of take for granted in a very lucky country, and that's a set of risks that I think we're now in a position to start turning around after them having got bad for quite a while. If people aren't familiar with Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, it's the most cited globally indicator of how countries are comparing on corruption, and Australia has been sliding for the last decade to its lowest point ever. So I think it is a really crucial time to be talking about what's going to happen next after a period of very intense debate, and I think it'll be, we're now looking at a quiet but long overdue revolution in the approach to some of these issues.
What a great close. Thank you, AJ. Quiet but long overdue revolution. Thanks all of you for wonderful welcomes there. I want to get us started. So the conversation tonight is really focused on those two reform areas. And of course, there has been so much attention on the need for a Federal Integrity Commission. But that's not the full story, and we will come back to it. But I do want to start us off by asking about parliamentary standards and a code of conduct. So Alyssa, I'd invite you to share with us some information on what this might look like. Who and what would it cover? What are we talking about when we say code of conduct?
A great question. I think it's quite an intuitive concept to grasp, but really we're talking about rules, norms, and responsibilities. And this is really about making sure that our parliamentarians have a standard. So we don't actually have a code of conduct at the moment. So the federal parliament, along with the SA parliament, are the only parliaments in Australia that don't have a code. At the moment, federally, we do have a statement of ministerial standards, and people might unfortunately remember that as being referred to the bonk ban when it really came in, and that was largely in response to Barnaby Joyce's affair at the time, where Turnbull responded and put that standard in place. But we know it's extremely limited in that it only applies to ministers, and also it can be changed at the whim of the Prime Minister. So it's not a very high standard in terms of embedding that as a standard that applies to all parliamentarians, and in a way that's quite future-proof, where it can't change with the whims of leadership or the whims of government. So I guess to paint a bit of a picture about the code as well, and the discussion we're having at the moment, So Helen Haynes brought in the Commonwealth Parliamentary Standards Act back in 2020 that had a model code. It was drafted, I would say, more with the federal ICAC, federal integrity sort of lens on it. And since then, we've had what we call the Jenkins Review, or the Set the Standard report, which was in the wake of the experience of Brittany Higgins, the allegations that she made, the allegations of rape by another parliamentary staff member. And then, of course, things that came out with allegations, particularly against Attorney General at the time, Christian Porter. So Sex Discrimination Commissioner Kate Jenkins went and had a look and I guess a discussion with a lot of people in Parliament about the culture in that place, and came out with this extensive report which has 28 recommendations. One of them is recommendations for code of conduct, and she's recommended 3 codes. So one for parliamentarians, one for staff, and one for the precinct. And she said it really needs to be implemented in the next 12 months. So we're already a little bit behind the ball, thanks to the election. But really the Parliament is really behind in talking about a code. So we're behind in terms of where we sit nationally. Like I said, South Australia is the only other one that doesn't have a code of conduct. They did have a review into harassment that recommended a code. A lot of professional bodies have codes of conduct, which is, I think, why a lot of people are familiar with the concept. And then internationally as well, in the UK and Canada in particular, they have codes of conduct that their parliamentarians are tied to. So it's really about trying to get those behaviours that we want to see in our parliamentarians embedded into an actual rule. So in terms of where that conversation is at, and I guess part of the reason I'm here today is when Haynes drafted her model code, it was really done with that federal integrity sort of lens on it. But since the Jenkins report has come out, it's sort of exposed that we've got 2 conversations about one rule, so that being the code, happening at the same time. And I was up on the Hill last week and talking to various parliamentarians there. It's pretty clear to me that people haven't joined the dots, that we really need the one code to satisfy both issues. So that code needs to include general things or things that would be more in the sort of integrity bucket, looking at materiality, conflicts of interest, decision-making, responsibility. And then it needs to look at things of character, and particularly things that cover off issues of gender equity. So talking about the behaviours, having specificity that we don't want harassment, bullying, sexual assault or sexual harassment in our parliament. Ideally things that model good behaviour, so talking about respect, inclusivity, valuing diversity. These are all the sort of things that need to go into a code of conduct that's going to solve from a federal integrity and from, I guess, a behaviour and a character base that will address the issues of gendered misconduct that we've seen. And I guess some of the tests for that, the proof is in the pudding, right? We need to be able to apply that code to what happened in the last parliament. So we had allegations against Porter, we had allegations against Andrew Laming, where he took an inappropriate picture of a woman, a staff member, I think it was. Alan Tudge had allegations against him of mainly domestic violence, so emotional and physical abuse. And then there's been also allegations against Barnaby Joyce, repeated allegations, mainly from people outside the parliament, of sexual harassment. So if we don't have a code that solves for these issues, then I would say that code has failed in actually creating a workplace that has the behaviours that Australians want to see from our parliamentarians. And I guess the other quick point I would make is that, again, we need to future-proof it. So we can't have it at the ministerial standards level that it's at now. It really needs to be legislated for. There's a question around the process of that and making sure there's a really good process to make the code do everything we want it to do. But ultimately, it needs to be enshrined in legislation so that only the parliament can change it. So it's got to be really excellent before it gets in there. Hopefully that's covered off quite a few things. Happy to take any questions, and I'm sure Anthony and AJ have some thoughts as well.
Yeah, well, I do. I think that that the startling thing about the absence of a proper code of conduct for members federally, I leave aside ministerial standard of conduct, which is a pretty ineffective document anyway. But the problem is that battle has been going on for over 30 years. The first recommendation for a code of conduct was in 1975. And every 2 or 3 years, it pops up again, only to sink back into the mud like some primeval beast. Why, over 30 years, we've not been able to get a federal code of conduct is extraordinary. And I think it's one of the reasons why there's a loss of trust in the political system and in politicians. It's one of the reasons why Transparency International's CPI shows the decline and fall of Australia's reputation. And we see instances again and again of the undue influence of money in politics, of favourable treatment for vested interests. We see the lobbying situation out of control. We see decision-making that is not made in the public interest. Now, it's not going to be cured by a code of conduct, but if we had a proper set of standards for behaviour right there in front of the parliamentarians and a mechanism for enforcing it, then I think that we would definitely see an improvement in standards.
Yeah, and it doesn't sound like it should be a big thing, does it? Just some
No.
basic behaviours that are being expected. Great, thank you. And AJ, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think the great way about how you described it, Alyssa, I mean, you really get across that part of the problem has not just been our general complacency or the general assumption that somehow federal politics and politicians or the whole federal public sector are above these sorts of things, but the bittiness of the way that we approach things. Because I think it's tragic, but actually, on the other hand, very good, finally, that things got so bad in terms of workplace conduct that the momentum for change is now unstoppable after so many years of people dodging the question of having the same sort of basic regulatory regime for conduct in an organisation that other parliaments have and every organisation under the sun has in the rest of our society. But it's really, like there's been so many bits. I mean, it was only in under the Turnbull government that the abuse of parliamentary expenses saw the creation of an independent parliamentary expenses authority. That was actually an opportunity to do parliamentary standards properly. And initially, like in the UK, the government was going to call it an independent parliamentary standards authority, not just an expenses authority. But it was like, no, we missed that opportunity to actually make it broader and just continued to focus on, whether people have put in the right receipts. Then we've had the debate about a broader code of conduct. And in fact, the Helen Haynes bill was based on the Cathy McGowan bill. And I should really give credit for the fact that that type of code of conduct was very much based on the recommendations from Ken Coghill, the former Speaker of the Victorian Parliament, and his involvement in the global Commonwealth Parliamentary Association that drew up model approaches to codes of conduct for parliamentarians. So a lot of good thinking and global experience has gone into that particular example, very much based on Victoria. But it's taken this terrible workplace conduct to actually force finally the momentum to actually have something. And clearly it's beyond the pale that we've got to this point, but at least that will now force it to happen. So you're quite right. And it certainly worries me if parliamentarians themselves aren't, if not enough of them are joining the dots yet, because I think when as we get into the discussion about what this means and how it would work, this is one of the best, as I think Tony might have mentioned, this is one of the best things that parliamentarians can have, is a regime that is based in the parliament, based on principles written by themselves to say, this is what we're going to do. These are the standards that we are undertaking to uphold. And let's have a regime for making sure that when people have got concerns about breaches of these standards, there's good processes in place for dealing with them. Not just corruption, but the whole range of things that we expect from good decision makers, good parliamentarians and good ministers as well, for that matter. So it's a huge opportunity to address some of the core problems that are driving public concern about integrity broadly in Australia, which is concerns about parliamentarians and whether they're really doing the job that we're all electing them and pay them to do. And that job clearly does not include abusing their own staff or letting these sorts of environments unfold. But once we hopefully deal with that, we're actually talking about a code that will uphold the things that we want, not just the things that we don't want.
Yeah, wonderful. I think that distinction between not just punishment, but also creating a set of values that we should aspire to and seek to be inspired by our parliamentarians is a really interesting point. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I think I might move us along into the Federal Anti-Corruption Commission now. We're getting there at the end there. And I might pass to Anthony to start with a bit of a general overview of what the objective and scope of this kind of body might be.
Yes, I've thought long and hard about that. I suppose there's various ways you could describe it. I suppose at the narrow end of the spectrum, its object is to uncover corruption, which often lurks in very dark corners, and to do so by the use of special powers. Secondly, it's to expose that corruption to public gaze. And thirdly, to place it in a responsible report before Parliament. Secondly, I think there's a broader avenue that is within the object and scope of a federal commission, and that is to better educate the public service and the body politic. So that goes hand in hand, if you like, with the code of conduct concept. But it's done on an institutional basis. So people overlook the fact that often with state ICACs or territory ICACs, a report is furnished which demonstrates that there's been instances of corrupt behaviour by individuals, but there's often a second report that is published, and it's called, corruption prevention and protection, which looks at it in a more institutionalised way to see how the government departments or institutions can have better, better ways of conducting themselves, better ways of protecting themselves from corruption. And so I think that's an important aspect of a federal body as well. And finally, it's there, I think, generally to uplift the standards of public life and public administration, and I think to restore Australia's declining reputation in that area. So I think that's, and the scope of it, of course, is to cover all aspects of public administration, from law enforcement bodies to the public service, to parliamentarians, to their staff, and to ministers and their staff, and senior bureaucrats as well. So it's a big field, and it's a challenge, but it's what we need.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, that idea that the scope is actually much broader than parliamentarians themselves, and really needs to do kind of a whole lot of different things and cover a whole lot of different potential scenarios. You mentioned some state models. I'm wondering if any of them are worth copying, or if there's things we can learn from them to not do.
Well, I think both. The answer to that is both. I think what is happening at the moment federally is that the Attorney General and his team are looking at all of the state and territory systems to draw out the best from them that accord with the principles they want to see in a federal body. These bodies at state level are often under attack. So I think the public get the idea that there's a lot of things wrong with them, but I don't think there is really. I think that concerted attack is often unjustified. Of course, you can always improve every institution. And, we've seen attacks on the institutions in South Australia, in Queensland more recently, and also at the present time in Victoria. Each of those, we could talk about for hours. And I'm sure that there are improvements that could be made in each field at state level. And I'm sure once we have a federal body, that it won't be impervious to criticism either. But it's got to be good criticism. It's got to be valid and soundly based, not this sort of, I like to talk about the people who attack state ICACs as anti-ICACers. We talk about anti-vaxxers. Well, there's a lot of anti-ICACers around too. And they're not always reasonable or logical, and they're not always correct. But as I say, no institution's perfect, and improvements can always be made. And I think the federal body, the Federal Attorney General's Department, is taking a very sound approach to this at the moment.
Wonderful. I think we'll come back to that a little bit. It's interesting to hear about those anti-corruption forces.
Anti-ICAC.
AJ, I might invite you to share any follow-up thoughts, and particularly if you could speak to the relationship between the ICAC and the Code of Conduct.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's really, it is a really important time now because of the fact that finally in 2018, it was the Labor opposition then that was the first major federal party to actually commit to supporting a federal anti-corruption agency. I mean, in fact, the Greens had been introducing a National Integrity Commission bill in every parliament since 2010, but finally one of the major parties committed to it, and really that was then the trigger for the Morrison government, or the Turnbull-Morrison government, to develop its own proposal. And I guess that was the big distinction between the Commonwealth and the states. The states, one by one, and I mean, there are various issues with the state and things to learn from the state agencies. But Tony is right. There's always been a general pattern of pushback, and that pattern of pushback is what confirms that these agencies are doing their job, because if they weren't doing their job, they wouldn't be disturbing anybody's sleep. But the key thing was that up until then, the Commonwealth, and up until soon, the Commonwealth only had the criminal law of corruption and police investigations to try and investigate corruption, which is far too narrow, far too limited and restrictive, not proactive, can't get to the bottom of things very often in terms of the problems that have to be dealt with. So hopefully now, with the change of government and the fact that after a lot of debate over a model from under the Morrison government that was very much focused still primarily on criminal law enforcement rather than moving towards a holistic approach to tackling corruption. Now we are talking about a more holistic approach, but there's still some big choices to be made. And I think it's very important for people to notice that originally we were talking about a National Integrity Commission, an integrity commission as opposed to an anti-corruption commission. And certainly what the crossbenchers, Cathy McGowan, Helen Haynes, the Greens have all put into place as models to show how this could be done are a much broader integrity commission models that have the catching the bad guys machinery in them, but also a much broader mandate for corruption prevention of the kind that Tony was talking about, but broader again on a national basis, taking seriously the Commonwealth's responsibilities for whistleblower protection in the public sector and the private sector, things that a federal government has to think about that state governments don't necessarily have to think about in terms of how we fight corruption to protect our international reputation and cross-boundary corruption factors and forces. I think it's very important now to recognise that what the incoming government's committed to is a National Anti-Corruption Commission now, which is not necessarily the same as a National Integrity Commission of the kind that was put together in the crossbench proposal. So on one hand, I think Tony's right. The design of that anti-corruption commission, the catching bad guys machinery, I think is now back on track. The question of the broader landscape of having an integrity commission with those other key elements is still a question, really yet to be resolved. And to come back to the Code of Conduct, I think that's an example of where not taking a holistic enough view of the integrity reform is a risk for any government. We see it around the world all the time, and it's already the fact that we don't have a clear plan for the parliamentarians' code of conduct when a lot of people are concerned about the risk of politicians' corruption. So there's an assumption in the minds of many people reasonably that the Anti-Corruption Commission will deal with all those breaches of conduct by politicians. So we've seen this idea pop into the public domain that somehow magically this Anti-Corruption Commission is going to be able to sack politicians for breaching the code of conduct. That's not going to happen. Under the Constitution, it can't happen. You actually can't sack politicians unless they've committed a criminal offence. then you can't actually sack politicians. They're there, they're elected by the people, they can't be removed. So they can be disendorsed by parties and they can be shamed out of office, but they can't be sacked. And they certainly can't be sacked by an anti-corruption commission. So it's an example of the type of furphy that erupts when you don't have an overall plan and it's not clear to people how these things will fit together. What is really important about the relationship, if this is done properly, and I very much hope that it will be, and there's no reason why it can't be, so we should all be very optimistic, is that a good code of conduct and parliamentary standards regime with its own good independent investigation capacity within the parliament to get to the bottom of parliamentary wrongdoing can act as a really good protection for politicians, so that things that don't need to go to an anti-corruption commission don't go to an anti-corruption commission. They're dealt with by the parliament, and people get an outcome via the parliament. But that parliamentary standards commission, if it comes across evidence that somebody has actually been corrupt or suspects it, then it can just refer stuff to the Anti-Corruption Commission. So everything goes where it should go without any hullabaloo, and everybody's better off because the right machinery is dealing with the right issues, and we can all sleep at night knowing the system's looking after our interests. You know, we're lazy Australians, we love that. So I think that's just a reinforcement of why it's really important not to see an anti-corruption commission as necessarily the same as an integrity commission, and certainly not to see an anti-corruption commission as the sort of silver bullet, quick fix to everything, because we've already seen in public debate an example of why can become very dangerous, could derail the whole thing. So it's really a very important time for people to be tracking this whole debate, because all these decisions now have to be made.
I think, Isabella, if you think about it, what AJ may be saying is that with Helen Haynes's bill, we were going to get a National Integrity Commission, a NIC, and now we're going to get a National Anti-Corruption Bill, a NAC. So what's better, a NIC or a NAC, or a NIC-NAC for that matter? I don't know.
So many follow-up questions. I'll try and manage myself. I'd like to hear from Alyssa firstly, though, any additional thoughts you have on what's been discussed. And something I was wondering about that came up before was like an enforcement mechanism for code of conduct. You know, what does that mean? What is it? Like, is that ICAC or is that the Parliament? Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, it's well, AJ just touched on that. So it's and Haynes also put this in the Commonwealth Parliamentary Standards Act as well. And Jenkins in the standard report said the same thing. We need the Independent Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, so the IPSC, and that would be the enforcement mechanism. And so I guess there's a range of thinking that needs to be done around that, about making sure it has retrospective powers, it has you know, sanctions that actually have some teeth. But it's really interesting what you just said, AJ, in terms of maybe a bit of fear mongering that's happening and some government lines coming out about appointed commissioners sacking elected representatives. And I think that's very much a line we're seeing from the government that is permeating to other politicians as well in approaching this discussion. But my broad reflection is that I think these issues around character, and particularly, of course, from my perspective, gender-based violence or gender misconduct, really walk hand in hand with issues of corruption and integrity. And we saw that with Porter last year is a great example, you know, the allegations of historical rape, and then, you know, Porter's taking a bag of money, right? So these things are really intimately connected, and that's why we need to solve for both of them. And we have the opportunity to do that because the ICAC or integrity corruption is on the agenda more broadly. And so it's really bringing that discussion around set the standard and making a safe, inclusive, respectful parliament as part of the outcomes of the code. So yeah, I think those are my broad reflections. AJ and Anthony, you might have other thoughts though on enforcement.
Hang on, I want to ask a more specific question, if that's all right, before we get too into the detail. So sorry, there was a lot of interest from our audience in the pre-recorded questions about this kind of detail. So I'm going to turn the chat back on now, so that if there are specific questions that are coming up for you, you can share them. We'll see how many we can get to. I would please request that people keep their commentary to a minimum so that I can see the questions. So questions welcome, comments, try and save them for the end, please, so I can see what's coming through. But I just want to step back a bit, because what I'm hearing is that this is just like a huge job, right? The Integrity Commission, like the people enforcing a code of conduct. It's a lot of responsibility. Like, who are these people? Who gets to be in this body? How will appointments be made? Yeah, tell me a little bit about that. Whoever wants to go first.
Well, I think AJ is the key on this one.
I was going to nominate you, Tony, as the ex-judge. I mean, I think it's really important to keep in our minds separate the Anti-Corruption Commission, or the Integrity Commission, if we can succeed in re-establishing an Integrity Commission idea, and the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, because they'll be separate, completely separate. And it's really important to know that even though they can talk to one another, the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, a bit like the current Independent Parliamentary Expenses Authority, are people appointed by the Parliament. There will be people appointed by the Parliament, and they'll probably be, if there's more than one of them, they may well be ex-parliamentarians, respected ex-parliamentarians from different political parties. They will have they might be an ex-judge, but they wouldn't need to be an ex-judge, but they have to be. Basically, they're answerable to the Parliament. They're not a roaming, appointed person with no accountability. They'll be answerable to the Parliament, and they'll be reporting to the Parliament and triggering Ethics and Privileges Committee sanctions that already exist in the Parliament. And so we're not talking about something that will be outside the Parliament. We're talking about the Parliament regulating itself in a robust way that stands the test of time and is transparent when it needs to be, and otherwise not when it's not required. With the Anti-Corruption Commission, and this is where Tony is really much more of the expert, having been a commissioner, at least in passing of the New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption, you're talking about a requirement. I think what the Attorney General's design principles for the federal anti-corruption body include is that and this is very often true of anti-corruption commissions, is that the commissioners themselves are restricted to people who are either have been in the past or are eligible for appointment as a superior court judge, so a Supreme Court judge level person. That's not to say that these are judicial bodies, but it's a recognition that independence is crucial, the same way that we recognise independence of the judiciary from politics as being important. We want that type of independence. The legal skills that go with doing this job properly are really quite considerable. So that's some of the reasons why that sort of eligibility for judicial appointment is a standard criteria for the appointment of anti-corruption commissioners. But I think it's really important to note that it doesn't just have to be those people. In Queensland, we have a multi-member commission, including part-time commissioners who, and there's talk right now about beefing up, need to be able to represent the broader interests of society, that they're not just limited to a few lawyers. It's not a lawyer, it doesn't have to be a lawyer fest. We want a commission that has that expertise, has that independence, has those incredible skills to handle the really sensitive stuff professionally, but also to be able to make decisions about standards and morals and the standards of society and how they're shifting, and what is a breach of trust and where are the corruption risks that we need to be addressing. I think there's a real case for having multi-member commissions that bring in wider skills than just those legal skills myself. So that's not necessarily, doesn't seem to be a focus necessarily with the Federal Commission, but it's important to note that some state commissions have that broader design, and that's true internationally as well. Another feature about appointment, which is something that, I mean, we're not Tony and I have been in a consultation today with the Attorney General, which is public knowledge about the design of this thing. We can't reveal or don't want to reveal specific things that were said, but one of the things that's on the table and is in the design principles is making sure that there is bipartisan support for the appointment of commissioners of this kind, so that it's not just the government of the day appointing somebody who they have confidence will go after the other side and the opposition feeling that somebody's been appointed who they don't trust, who they just want to replace next time. It's really important, and state history has shown that it's quite possible to have a mechanism for bipartisan endorsement and support, and that is really, really crucial because it helps remind everybody that they've been part of appointing somebody who they supposedly trust to be able to do this very sensitive job properly.
Yeah, I agree with everything AJ said, particularly the last part. You know, I think that that idea of a bipartisan appointment is really crucial to getting the confidence of the community, and also the confidence of Parliament as a whole. It can't be just we've got the majority, so we're going to pick the person. It's really not a good look.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, so I'm really glad that has come up. I think, you know, this idea that it might end up being a partisan witch hunt against the former government is something that people are really concerned about. So I'm happy to hear that was on the table today. Anthony, just a question from the chat here that I want to ask from, I've lost it, so I've lost the name, sorry, from someone. Very good question about the nick and the knack. Just a clarification, in order to capture misconduct by senior bureaucrats, is the suggestion that we do need the Integrity Commission rather than just the Anti-Corruption Commission, or could you have an Anti-Corruption Commission that had that wider scope?
We're talking about two different things. The fundamental point about the Anti-Corruption Commission, even though we wanted to have these broader aspects, such as protection of whistleblowers and incorporating the idea of, you know, a parliamentary integrity leader, all of those things, of course, would be desirable, and they may not, you know, maybe they'll come in due course, not immediately. But I think you've got to remember that as far as the conduct of people who are to be examined by the Integrity Commission are concerned, that all falls to be determined by the definition of corruption. And that's not something that the Parliamentary Integrity Commissioner would be interested in, other than identifying if it comes before her or him, and then, if necessary, referring it onto the integrity body. So there's the difference. You know, integrity, standards, codes of conduct, they're not the purview of the NAC side of things. The NAC side of things is concerned with corruption and the definition of corruption, and that's what they can investigate. And it has to be serious corruption. They can't just investigate trivial things, and that's why I don't think you need to worry too much about, you know, the way some politicians are saying, is this going to be a witch hunt and a bit of a payback from our political opponents? That's not going to happen, because there are going to be definitions here that really mean that only really serious matters can be investigated and be the subject of corrupt conduct findings. And I think if you have the right people appointed to the job, once again, with bipartisan support, so there's confidence in the system, then once again, I think you will dispel that notion that this is some sort of political payback machine or contrivance. What do you others think? Do you agree with that or not?
I think that's right. If we design it properly, I think is the key thing. If it's not designed properly, we know from national and international experience that we can get those outcomes. The weaponization of different enforcement agencies is quite, you know, well known around the world. It's a real problem. So again, it's a reason why we've got to do it well, and also figure out how the whole system fits together, so that neither of these types of new institutions are caught being embarrassed by the fact that they have been asked to do things that they weren't designed to do. And so again, it's a really important reason to do this. It can be done quickly, but it still needs to be done holistically. Just because you do things quickly doesn't mean that you don't have to do them well, and cut the corners. So certainly, yeah, I mean, an anti-corruption commission will capture misconduct by senior bureaucrats. And most importantly, what's clear now from the model that the Albanese government is going to progress is that we're not just talking about criminal conduct, we're talking about grey area corruption, abuses of trust, and things that are, we identify as corruption, the consequences of undue influence, the perversion of decision making through dishonest means and undue influence, corporate, inappropriate corporate influence and capture is part of that. That can be corrupt without necessarily it being a criminal offence. Very often we identify it, and then once we've identified it, we criminalise it later. But you've got to be able to identify it first. So an anti-corruption commission of the model that most states have, not all, but most, and the Commonwealth is now looking at, as opposed to under the Morrison government, will have that breadth because of the definition of corruption, as Tony said. But the pro-integrity functions, the corruption prevention functions, the whistleblower protection functions that I notice a few people are commenting on in the chat as well, are like a crucial part of the machinery, and they are an actual part of the Australian Federal Integrity Commission model that Helen Haynes has and the other crossbenchers have been putting forward. So that's why there's a genuine question about, given that we know what those look like in legislation now, there's a genuine question about why can't they be done now? Or if they're not going to be done now, then exactly when are they going to be done? So that's why it's an interesting time.
Yeah, perfect. I just wanted to move us on into that design question and hear, like, where are these things at? So you two mentioned you were in some meetings today. Alyssa, you mentioned Haynes' former bill on a code of conduct before. We're in a new parliament. Just really interested to hear from all of you in just a couple of minutes. What's happening, what's next, and particularly how can the community and people who have joined us tonight, help make these things a reality?
Well, the promise has been made by the Attorney General that there will be an anti-corruption commission legislated before the end of the year. And I think from what we know, and we probably can't say all the things that we know because of the meeting we've been at today, but that's moving ahead. I think we can say that's moving ahead to fruition and will almost certainly take place before the end of the year.
Great. And Alyssa, on the other bill, and then AJ, I'd like to hear you just say a bit more. You said it's about the design. So how's it happening, from here? What's next?
Yeah, I think Anthony and AJ would have a better idea about the time frames, because I think you're talking about integrity and corruption. The code of conduct is inherent within that. I think the perspective that Fair Agenda is coming from is making sure we're talking about Set the Standard and Jenkins as part of that process. And there's so I guess not to bore people with the detail, but to bore people with the detail, there was a joint standing committee on parliamentary standards that was set up in response to the Set the Standard report, which came out at the end of last year. That was stood up and then, of course, disestablished when the parliament dissolves. That needs to be re-established. And we meeting with the government last week, they did commit to that. And there's also a parliamentary leadership task force, which has representation from independents, Greens, the LNP, and then, of course, the current government that is feeding into that process. So the Joint Standing Committee, though, previously had a process where they were calling for submissions on the code. Those are going to be due in August, and then they're going to report back in November. So it's that expectation that will still go ahead, and that will inform a discussion about a robust code. We're making a working assumption that there will be one code that has to solve for the integrity corruption bit, and also for the Set the Standard, making sure Parliament is not a place where people can do terrible things and is horribly disrespectful, which we've seen in the past. The question is how those things come together and the time frame. So AJ and Anthony, I'm sure, probably have more specific ideas. One of the things we're seeing might play out is that if the government does want to progress this at a rate of knots, which is what it's looking like, there might be legislation that goes through and a code of conduct potentially in a regulation, which then would allow for a process. And then when that process is completed, we move that code from a regulation into legislation. That's one idea. But I mean, mean, there's many others, but the point is there has to be a robust process around the code, and we can't necessarily rush that based on the timeframes that the Joint Standing Committee already set out. So interested to hear everyone else's thoughts on it, though, because I suspect you might have other timeline ideas.
I think that's a really interesting comment about the timeline. We seem to suffer from a bit of a problem in Australia and the way that we legislate, which is either to take far, far, far too long or never do it, or to try and rush things. And I think this is an opportunity to get the balance right on both issues, I suspect, because it is really historic and important reform. So, I mean, you know, we don't want to say, you know, and we undertook not to say what the Attorney General said in our consultations today, but we can say what we said. And one of the things that I said, which I firmly believe, is that on the National Anti-Corruption Commission, given the significance and the complexity of some bits of the reforms, given that we've taken this long, then we can afford a little bit more time than ramming it through by the end of the year, if that means that we get it right. So, I mean, you know, my advice to the Attorney General today was that I believe that he, as in the government, it's not just him, is trying to go at 110 in 100 zone when travelling at 100 kilometres an hour would be both legal and perfectly adequate. So on one hand, I like Tony, you know, and like everybody, after much delay, I want to see these things done as quickly as possible, and they obviously need to be done quite quickly at the beginning of a parliamentary term before sort of politics takes its normal course. But so this is a great opportunity, but I think we can afford to get it right. So I would like to see these processes unfold in a way that means that they can. I mean, the interesting thing is that although there's been a lot of debate about a federal integrity commission or anti-corruption commission already, and very counterproductive consultations under the previous government that were never listened to and never went anywhere, and all sorts of things, there is now a process for building community understanding and support for these reforms through the parliamentary committee processes that should now happen to review the legislation as well. And they shouldn't just be short, sharp inquiries to ram it through so that politicians get their chance to vent and negotiate it. They should be things that actually give the public an opportunity to understand what's being done and where they fit into the picture. So I really hope that the government chooses to do this properly, even if it means taking a little bit more time.
Wonderful. What a cracker of a chat it has been. I want to keep my commitment to everyone to try and wrap us up on time. I will ask you all for some closing thoughts in just a second. But thank you all so much for joining us. It's been wonderful, and such a breadth and depth of expertise and experience, and I've learned a lot, so I hope the audience at home has as well. Tonight's been the first of what will be monthly webinars from us, these democracy deep dives. They're going to be held on the first Wednesday of every month on the reforms in our framework and on the campaign, and there'll be an opportunity to connect our community with experts and with each other. Next month, our focus is on organising for change. So we'll be looking at what it takes to build a powerful community-driven movement for a fair democracy. The guests are yet to be 100% confirmed, but I can promise you they'll be excellent. And if I manage to pull a panel half as good as tonight, you know it'll be a great discussion. So please RSVP. There's a link in the chat just there. I think, Tony, the thing that happened last time is we didn't have the HTTP in the link and it didn't work. Before Malcolm catches me out again in the chat. So if you can just make sure the link works for me, please, that would be wonderful. Please do RSVP and come along again next month. But to close off our great discussion tonight on a code of conduct and a Federal Integrity Commission, I'd love to hear each of you just share a bit of you know, what's next? Once these reforms are passed, is politics good now? Have we got integrity? Can we all shut up shop and go home? That's a Dorothy Dixer for you. And then what is the one next change that you would like to see after these two reforms? What's the one next thing that you'd love? And we'll go that original order, Alyssa, Anthony, and then AJ.
Oh gosh, that's such a hard question. I think, yeah, obviously it's not going to be magically fixed. I mean, there's a discussion this week in the Liberal Party about creating quotas for women. I think, you know, part of the role I see with the Code of Conduct is about prevention, and I think that needs to be, you know, on the heads of the parties that are seeking to represent Australians, and they need to do some heavy work in terms of making sure the candidates they get in meet all these standards. So, you know, buckle up. They've got a lot to do. So I'd like to see them stepping up to the plate on that.
No, we can't all just shut up and go home, I'm afraid. There's so much more to do. But I think that I'm sure AJ and Alyssa would agree that we can be much more optimistic at the moment than we were 12 months ago. And you know, from my point of view, as the chair of the Centre for Public Integrity, we would probably start to concentrate more on the undue influence of money in politics and look to try and urge donation reform, campaign spending reform. And I think allied with that, truth in political advertising. They're three big areas that I would like to now get my teeth into. We've now got hopefully we've got an ICAC with teeth, as people have been saying. Well, we've got to get our teeth into other things as well, and I'm looking forward to the challenge.
And yes, I mean, I would say that definitely there's more to do, but the fact that there's a lot to do should not deter people from the fact that it's also achievable, and so much of it is really overdue. So all of Our Democracy agenda, you know, one of the reasons why at Transparency International Australia we're so keen to support it is that it's all actually doable because it's all been done by people elsewhere. And in fact, if you look at things like taking money out of politics, reforming political campaign finance, political donations, etc. The Commonwealth is a cowboy, you know, Wild West on this, but a majority of state governments now have introduced caps on campaign expenditure. They're starting to progressively introduce real-time donation disclosure, etc., etc. So all of these things are actually very practical and can be done, you know, they don't all have to be done at exactly the same time, but there's a lot that can be done. And once it is done, we will be able to genuinely be able to say, okay, we've got a system that's as good as anywhere in the world. And we know we can do it because we can take reforms that we know work both from other countries and also from even within Australia, from state governments. So it is, I think, as Tony said, it is a good time.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. And of course, we're not going anywhere. We are going to be keeping the pressure on. It's one of the reasons that Our Democracy movement is so committed to bringing people together and building a powerful movement for a strong democracy. So more on that next month. Just one last plug for my next webinar. If